The human body shuts down at -35 degrees. Blood turns to sludge, skin blackens, and the mind begs for sleep. When a bush plane went down in the Alaskan wilderness, one widow was left with nothing but animal hides, freezing snow, and a terrifying choice: build or die. The engine of the Cessna 208 Caravan didn't just fail. It screamed before it died. Harper Jane gripped the armrests so hard her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting to the cockpit where pilot Greg Larson was frantically flipping switches. Beside Harper sat Thomas Miller, a commercial surveyor who had bought the last seat on his charter flight over the Brooks Range. But Harper wasn't there for business. Resting in a small, reinforced steel urn in the cargo hold were the ashes of her husband Dorian, an anthropologist who had spent his life studying the indigenous tribes of northern Alaska. Harper was flying into the remote village of Anaktuvuk Pass to return his ashes, along with a massive collection of raw caribou, seal, and bear hides he had promised to return to the tribal elders. Then came the sickening lurch. Gravity abandoned them. The plane clipped the jagged edge of a snow-covered ridge, tearing the right wing away like wet paper. The fuselage tumbled through the pristine, merciless white of the Alaskan wilderness, finally slamming into a grove of ancient pines. Silence descended, heavier than the snow. When Harper regained consciousness, the world was sideways and painted in brutal shades of gray and white. She tasted copper. Her left arm throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. Unbuckling her harness, she fell against the slanted wall of the cabin. "Greg," she croaked. The cockpit was crushed in wood. Greg was gone, having died instantly on impact. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She turned to the passenger seats. Thomas was missing. "Thomas?" She screamed, pushing her way through the mangled door of the Cessna. The wind hit her like a physical blow. The temperature was already plummeting toward 20 below zero, and the sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks. She found footprints leading away from the wreckage. Relief washed over her. Thomas was alive. He must be scouting for help. She crawled back into the fuselage to wait. She found a heavy parka from her luggage and huddled in the corner, shivering as the adrenaline faded. Hours passed. The sky turned a bruising purple, then a pitch, starless black. Thomas never returned. It wasn't until the faint morning light broke that Harper realized the horrifying truth. The plane's emergency survival kit, the flare gun, the emergency locator beacon, and all the pre-packaged rations were gone. Thomas hadn't gone scouting. He had taken the only means of survival and abandoned her, betting that a lone, injured widow would only slow him down. He had left her to die. Despair is a quiet killer. It lulls you into the snow, whispering that sleep is easier than the fight. Harper sat in the wreckage, her tears freezing to her eyelashes before they could even roll down her cheeks. By noon of the second day, the pilot's thermometer in the ruined dash read 35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes solid in less than 10 minutes. The metal fuselage of the plane was no longer a shelter. It was a freezer box, conducting the cold straight into her bones. She needed insulation. She needed a fire. But more than anything, she needed an enclosure that could trap whatever heat she could generate. She stumbled to the cargo hold, prying the jammed door open with a broken piece of landing gear. Inside, miraculously intact, were Dorian's crates. She tore them open. Dozens of heavily cured caribou hides, thick, grisly pelts, and waterproof sealskins spilled out into the snow. She remembered a conversation she'd had with Dorian years ago by a warm fireplace in Seattle. "People think igloos are just blocks of ice," he had said, tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "But the true survival architecture is the quinchee, combined with the hide frame. Snow is an incredible insulator, Harper. It traps the dead air. If you line it with hides, you create a thermos. The cold stays out and the heat reflects back in. She had to build a dome." But she had no shovel to pile the snow, and the powder on the ground was too dry, too crystalline to pack into solid blocks. She had to engineer a hybrid structure. Harper began by stripping the interior of the plane. She managed to wrench free the flexible aluminum ribbing from the cabin's ceiling and several long strands of heavy-duty wiring. Dragging them out into a clearing protected by heavy snowdrift, she began to form a skeleton. Her hands, encased in 2 pairs of wool gloves, felt like clumsy blocks of wood. Frostbite was already threatening her fingertips, turning them numb and pale. She forced the aluminum rods into the frozen earth, bending them in an overlapping hemisphere, a metal spider web about 6 feet in diameter and 4 feet high. Next came the hides. This was where Dorian's life's work became her lifeline. She dragged a heavy, stiff pelt to the frame. She used the seal skins on the outside layer. They were incredibly windproof and water-resistant. Overlapping them like shingles, she tied them to the aluminum frame using the plane's wiring. Inside, she draped the massive grizzly and caribou hides, ensuring the fur faced inward. The hollow hairs of the caribou fur were nature's perfect insulators, designed to trap body heat. But a tent of skins wasn't enough against 35 degrees Fahrenheit winds that were beginning to howl down the mountain pass. The wind would slice right through the seams. She needed the thermal mass of snow. Using a piece of jagged sheet metal from the wing as a makeshift trowel, Harper began the most grueling labor of her life. She scooped the dry, powdery snow and piled it against the hide-covered dome. Because the snow wouldn't pack, she had to rely on a terrifying method. She used a small camp stove she found buried under a seat to melt snow in a thermos, and she poured the near-freezing water over the powdery snow piles. The water hit the freezing air and the snow, instantly crystallizing, cementing the powder into a rock-hard ice shell over the hides. Layer by layer, inch by agonizing inch, she built a wall of packed ice-fused snow around the dome, 2 feet thick. She left a small, low tunnel for an entrance positioned away from the prevailing winds and poked a tiny ventilation hole at the top of the dome using an antenna rod to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. By nightfall of the 3rd day, she was completely exhausted. Her muscles screamed and her core temperature was dropping dangerously low. She crawled through the small tunnel, dragging the last caribou hide behind her to seal the entrance. Inside the dome, the darkness was absolute, but almost immediately the roaring howl of the wind outside vanished, muffled to a distant dull hum. Harper sat in the center of her small shelter. She placed her small camp stove on a flat piece of metal and ignited it, setting it to the lowest possible flame to conserve fuel. She also lit a small emergency candle she had found in her coat pocket. Then she waited. Outside, the temperature plunged to 100 degrees Fahrenheit as a massive Arctic front moved in. Trees snapped in the forest, their sap freezing and expanding until the trunks exploded like rifle shots. But inside the dome, a miracle of thermodynamics was occurring. The small flame from the candle in the stove produced a tiny amount of heat. Normally, in a metal plane or a nylon tent, this heat would vanish instantly. But the 2 feet of packed, ice-crusted snow stopped the cold from penetrating. The heavy layer of sealskin blocked the drafts, and the thick, hollow-haired caribou fur lining the interior caught the radiating heat and reflected it back into the center of the dome. Added to this was Harper's own body heat, outputting roughly 100 watts of thermal energy. Within 2 hours, Harper noticed something incredible. She unzipped the top of her parka. The air around her wasn't just survivable, it was warm. She watched as a drop of condensation formed on the tip of a caribou hair overhead. The temperature inside the dome had climbed from the freezing 0 to a staggering +45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was still slowly rising. She took off her gloves. She could feel her fingers. She had built a sanctuary in hell. Wrapped in her husband's hides, smelling the earthy, wild scent of the cured leather, Harper broke down. She wept for Dorian, she wept for Greg the pilot, and she wept in sheer, overwhelming relief. She was going to live. On the 5th night, the storm broke, leaving a landscape bathed in the eerie blue light of a full moon. Harper was rationing her last few crackers and melting snow over her candle when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. But it was coming closer to the dome. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Wolves, a grizzly, woken from hibernation. She gripped her makeshift sheet metal knife, her knuckles white. The heavy caribou hide blocking her tunnel entrance twitched. Then a gloved hand pushed weakly underneath it. Harper scrambled back, holding her weapon high. "Help?" A voice croaked. It was a sound barely human, a rasping wheeze of torn lungs and frozen vocal cords. Harper kicked the hide away. Lying in the tunnel, covered in a thick layer of rime ice, was Thomas Miller. The man who had stolen her supplies and left her to die was looking up at her with eyes wide with terror and agony. His face was a horrific patchwork of black, necrotic flesh. Severe frostbite had planed his nose and both cheeks. His hands, still clutching the emergency locator beacon, were frozen into rigid, blackened claws. He had tried to hike out, overestimating his abilities and underestimating the brutal Alaskan terrain. He had walked in a massive circle, utterly lost, before the storm forced him back toward the wreckage. He had found her dome by following the faint glow of her ventilation hole. "Please," he whispered, his eyes rolling back. So cold. Harper froze. A dark, primal part of her mind screamed to push him back out into the snow. He had condemned her to death. He had looked at her, a grieving widow, and decided she was expendable. If she let him in, he would consume her precious heat, her space, her oxygen. She looked at the locator beacon frozen in his grip. Harper closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She thought of Dorian. Dorian, who had dedicated his life to preserving humanity and community in the harshest places on Earth. "You bastard!" she hissed. She reached forward, grabbed Thomas by the collar of his coat, and violently hauled him into the dome. She sealed the entrance behind him. Thomas was violently shivering, slipping into the final stages of hypothermia. Harper knew she had to act fast. She stripped off his frozen outer layers, a dangerous and exhausting task. She dragged him onto the thickest grizzly pelt, wrapped him in 2 caribou hides, and placed her own body next to his, sharing the ambient heat of her sanctuary. For 2 days they stayed in the dark. 11 the dark. Harper rationed the last drops of melted snow, forcing them past Thomas's cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering apologies to ghosts Harper couldn't see. On the morning of the 8th day, the silence of the wilderness was shattered by a rhythmic, heavy thumping. Thwack, 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 thwack. Helicopter rotus. Harper ripped the hide away from the tunnel. The brilliant, blinding sunlight poured in. She crawled out into the snow, the cold biting at her face, and looked up. A Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter was hovering over the tree line, kicking up a massive cloud of powder. They had finally picked up the signal from the beacon Thomas had brought back when Officer Henderson and his rescue team dropped down from the hoist. They ran toward the wreckage of the Cessna, expecting to find frozen corpses. Instead, they found Harper standing tall beside a bizarre ice-crusted mound in the snow. "Mom, are you Harper Jane?" Officer Henderson yelled over the deafening roar of the rotors, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I am," Harper shouted back, "and there's a man inside. He needs immediate medical evacuation. Severe frostbite." Henderson looked at the small hole in the side of the snow mound and back at Harper. She was pale, thin, and her hair was matted, but she was standing. She was alive. As the medics hauled Thomas out on a backboard, Henderson peered into the dome. He felt the wave of warm air hit his face. He saw the intricate weaving of the aluminum, the strategic layering of the pelts, and the thick, impenetrable walls of ice-packed snow. "How did you survive out here?" Henderson asked, awe lacing his voice. "It hit 40 below 2 nights ago. You should be dead." Harper looked back at the dome. It was a monument to desperation, to science, and to the man she had loved. She touched the icy exterior, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of it. "I had a good teacher," she said quietly. Thomas Miller survived, though he lost 3 fingers and his nose to the cold. He never spoke publicly about what happened during the first few days of the crash, but when questioned by the authorities about how he survived, he broke down in tears and simply said, "She played God, and she chose mercy." Not Harper Jane returned home to Seattle. She eventually made another trip back to Onotuvuk Pass, this time by snowmobile in the spring, to deliver the remaining hides and Dorian's ashes. When survival experts later analyzed her dome design based on her interviews and Officer Henderson's photographs, they were astounded. By combining modern metallurgy, the plane's ribs, with indigenous survival techniques, the Quingy snowpacking and the strategic layering of specific animal hides, Harper had inadvertently created one of the most perfectly insulated emergency shelters ever recorded. The temperature differential between the outside air and the interior of the dome was nearly 85 degrees, an engineering marvel built by a grieving widow with her bare hands. Nature is a ruthless adversary. It does not care about your grief, your background, or your plans for tomorrow. But Harper Jane proved that while the wilderness can strip away your modern conveniences, it cannot touch the resilience of the human mind. She didn't just survive the storm. She built a fortress out of it. If Harper's incredible survival story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more unbelievable true stories to light. What would you have done if you were in Harper's shoes when Thomas returned? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic survival tales. Stay safe out there.